Good afternoon, everyone. We are so excited for how we're going to spend our afternoon. If you're in St. Louis, it is 3 p.m., but if you're joining us from other places, it might even be evening for you. So apologies if I said afternoon, but we are so excited to have two incredible authors here to celebrate YA as a genre, which, as a reminder, YA books are for everybody, not just for young adults, even though that is definitely who they're written for. If you want to know more about that, we actually have a YA for adults book club. If you're interested in being an adult who joins book club to talk to other adults about YA books. My name is Stephanie. I'm with the Novel Neighbor. We're an independently owned and operated bookstore found in St. Louis, Missouri. If you're not familiar with Missouri, we're like right in the Midwest. That's how I always tell people. I personally did not grow up in the Midwest, and so it's very funny to explain to people the actual geography of where St. Louis falls. So obviously, if you're from St. Louis, you know exactly where we are, and we're in Webster Groves. And we're thrilled to have you watching today. Like I said, we have two incredible authors. The first one is Kathleen Glasgow, who is the #1 New York Times bestselling author of Girl in Pieces, You'd Be Home Now, and How to Make Friends with the Dark, as well as the co-author of the best-selling mystery series, The Agathas and The Night in Question. Her books have been published in more than 30 countries. And if you go to her website, you can actually find out more about her and also email her and say hi and get to do all of the things. Our second author today is Margot Harrison, who has a lifelong habit of creeping herself out and now attempts to creep out others via her fiction. Thank you so much, Margot. You're very good at it. Her first YA novel, The Killer in Me, published in 2016, was an Indies Introduced pick and a finalist for the Vermont Book Award and received a starred review from Publishers Weekly. She has continued that success with her book, The Glare, as well as her third book, We Made It All Up, which was a Junior Library Guild selection and has appeared on the best of or most anticipated lists on BuzzFeed, Teen Vogue, Book Riot, and LitHub. She spends way too much time reviewing vintage YA books and making skits about her weird childhood on TikTok, which I'm sure that we'll talk about today because I know that Kathleen and I are both fans. She also occasionally tweets and chronicles her reading on Instagram. And she also loves hearing from readers. So again, you can visit her website and also get to talk to her. So Margot, Kathleen, thank you so much for being here.
Hi, thank you so much for having us. It's such a pleasure to get to talk to Margot today.
I know, I'm so excited. This is going to be a great conversation to listen to, so I'll see you two in just a bit.
Okay. Hi, Margot. It's so nice to meet you in person.
So great to meet you in person, too.
So I absolutely loved your latest book. Let me hold it up correctly. Only She Came Back. And this is your third book?
It's my fourth.
Your fourth book. Okay. So all of your books tend to have some very creepy subtext, right? Would you classify yourself as a thriller or a horror author or both?
I would say both. This book is kind of more mystery thriller, but I do have a book, The Glare, that I would call verging on horror, pretty close to horror.
Okay. Can you pitch this book to the readers who are watching right now?
I would love to. Okay, so this book, I'll hold it up, is the story of Curie, a lonely girl who falls in love with a YouTube influencer who has hundreds of thousands of followers. And she thinks that her dream is coming true when he asks her to go on a road trip to the Southwest. But things don't quite work out that way. And she ends up coming back alone, hence the title, with his bloody sweatshirt around her waist. And she says that he just disappeared out there, but nobody believes her, and the true crime hounds are immediately on the case. This is also the story of a girl named Sam who went to high school with Curie and lives right next to her. And Sam is a true crime hound. She's obsessed with the case. And so she basically kind of stalks Curie and worms her way into her life to try to learn all her secrets for her own clout, hoping to kind of do a podcast or something. So as these two girls get closer, the question is, who's going to control this story?
So one of the things that I loved when I was reading this book is how you built out the world and how you structured it. So one, it has a lot to do with our obsession with true crime and social media. One thing, gaining clout on social media through someone else's story. Can you talk a little bit about how you built the story and what your inspiration was?
Yeah, my inspiration was a night of going down true crime rabbit holes, basically. Well, it started when my sister sent me a link to a story about minimalist influencers on YouTube. So I read that, and that ended up inspiring the character of Callum in the book, The Influencer. But then I decided, well, since I'm here on YouTube, maybe I should check out that Gabby Petito case that everybody's talking about, which at that point was sort of unresolved. They had not found her remains yet. So I checked it out. I watched some of the videos. I was kind of chilled by it. But I was also fascinated by the way people were kind of taking up this story and watching all the videos that she and her boyfriend had posted and interpreting them. I mean, it was creepy, but it was also kind of fascinating that people were trying to insert themselves into this story. So I thought that's what I'm really interested in. Well, I kind of had two thoughts. Like, first of all, what if it were a young woman who was the one who came back alone and was suspected of killing her boyfriend? How would people treat her differently? How would the case be different in that if that happened? Because we have this tendency to be sort of fascinated by pretty young white women as the victims of crime, but we also, when they're not the victims, we sometimes vilify them. So that kind of interested me. And also the social media aspect, how does social media play into this?
Why do you think that as readers and just consumers that we have like this fascination with like now solving crimes through the media and just the bits of information that we get from little clips on YouTube or police reports and whatnot? Why do you think we're so fascinated with this?
I've thought a lot about that because I've been kind of fascinated. I mean, I wouldn't call myself a huge true crime reader, but I have been interested in this since I was young, just like stories about murder and what makes people commit murder and things like that. I mean, I think part of it is that a lot of us are anxious about being victims of crime or just about bad things happening to us generally. So we want to sort of enact those scenarios in our imagination and think about what we would do, or we want to imagine that we could solve a crime and have power over it.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's a big factor. And also just, I mean, to a certain extent, it's like the road accident phenomenon. People are fascinated by something bad happening to other people. It's not great, but it's hard to kind of avoid that fascination.
So speaking of like being fascinated by true crime for a long time. So when I was 13, I read this book, Blood Letters and Bad Men, which is like, it's a narrative encyclopedia of American criminals from the Pilgrims to the present. And it came out, I think, in the early 80s. And it was like, I love this book to this day. Like some of the entries are so short, but they're like a woman in 1876 who was suddenly discovered with like 60 bodies buried behind her homestead, where she'd been taking in like men who came by, like just walking hobos wanting work. And then she would clock them with the frying pan and then write to their like family and say, oh, he needs like a little bit of money and whatnot. And the family would send money. And she got away with this for years. And one thing that has always fascinated me about women and true crime, particularly like women who commit crimes, they tend to be much quieter about it. Do you know, like their methods are much different than like men's methods when they do commit crimes. They're quieter about it and they're a little bit more, they have a little bit more dexterity in some ways. And I find that really interesting. And I found that interesting in your book as well. And if you could like talk a little bit about how you built Sam and Kiri's relationship in particular.
Yeah, well, Sam is fascinated with women who commit crimes. Mm-hmm. And that sort of has something to do with her own background, that she comes from a background of domestic violence, her dad being violent toward her mom. So it's almost a little bit of a fantasy for her. Like, what if a woman could have the power? It's not that she really wants to commit crimes, but she just likes to fantasize about wielding that power. Mm-hmm. So that's one reason that she's so drawn to Kiri, besides just wanting to know what happened and kind of use that information on social media for her own gain. But
and how long did it take you? Like, how many drafts did it take you to write this book? And were there any like big plot changes as you were writing? Because I know that when Liz and I were writing the Agathas together, because I'd never written a mystery, but Liz was very interested in she's a big mystery fan. And so she had to tell me, like, you need to hit certain beats here, and we need to have like red herrings, and we need to have a true clue. And she was very much into the technical aspect of building a mystery. So we went through like several drafts for that, because sometimes we would get to a point where like, okay, wait, it's all falling apart, and not in a good way. So when you were writing the novel, like, how many drafts did it take you, and did you encounter like any big changes that you had to make in the story?
Oh, good question. Because you two, you and Liz have amazing like red herrings, like false, like we think we've solved the mystery, but then we haven't actually solved it, and it's something completely different, which I love. I'm kind of new to the mystery genre too. I haven't read a whole lot of mysteries, so I'm kind of figuring it out as I go. With this book, I think I took about 3 months to write the first draft of it, which was very fast for me. So maybe a little bit too fast. I think, well, I had written the first 100 pages or so originally earlier, and submitted it to my editor that way. And at that point, I had a certain idea about how the story was going to go. But later I realized that just wasn't twisty enough, that my solution was interesting, but it was a little bit too expected. So I had to throw in some more twists. I don't know if there are enough twists, but I tried to make it twisty while also sort of making all the twists come organically out of the characters. And because this really is kind of a psychological mystery thriller, I think.
Yeah, it's very psychological. And what I loved about reading your book is that I remember when Liz and I were chatting as we were writing, and we were like, okay, some readers are going to know right away, or think that they know, like, what the big plot twist is, or who did it, or how it happened, because they're very experienced mystery or thriller readers. But at that point, what you have to do is you have to make sure that they're interested enough in your characters who don't know, that they're willing to follow those characters to the end of the book to watch out how they figure it out. And so you really have to have strong character base in mystery thrillers to keep readers invested. And I think that you did that really brilliantly in this book. You and I chatted a little bit over email about unlikable female characters.
Yes.
And if you could, I did not find Sam or Curie unlikable at all. Like, I think this is a really interesting question to me, like whether female characters are unlikable or not, because I don't like everybody in real life. You know what I mean? But does that mean I'm not going to finish like reading about them in a book? Like, why do you think that people might find Sam or Curie like unlikable?
I don't think they're unlikable.
I don't either.
So I'm glad that you don't, but it is something that I've heard, in reviews and so forth. So I get that that's a common opinion, but I think, Sam has a very acerbic voice. She thinks she's very tough. She's very sarcastic. Right. She feels like romance is sentimental and silly and things like that. So I get how that might turn people off. And of course, she's doing some pretty unethical things, investigating a crime, breaking into a motel room at one point, just some, things that are kind of not quite legal. So there's that aspect.
But, I think that this question of like unlikable female characters is only actually posed to female novelists and not to male novelists, as though we're supposed to write, pristine, perfect characters rather than flawed characters, which is what you're supposed to do in literature. Your characters are supposed to be flawed. They're supposed to encounter changes throughout the book. Their personalities should come through. They should be, I find they should be relatable. And even if you don't like what they're doing or how they're doing it, they can still be relatable to you. And we were talking about reviews before this started, and there was one review on Amazon where this adult had read the Agathas and posted this very long review saying that no one should read this book because these girls did really unethical and illegal things as they were solving this mystery in a book of fiction. And Liz and I were like, what is going on here? They are like 17 years old. They don't know how to solve a crime. Of course they're going to do the wrong thing. They're not experts, and they're in pursuit of like justice. So sometimes, like Sam does, you do things in pursuit of the truth.
Yeah, and I love how you did that. I mean, you have them sort of encountering the police at different points, but then going around the police, kind of like
Sure.
dodging around them.
Sure, they're kids. They don't have boundaries. They're going to do whatever. They're going to do whatever they have access to at that moment. And because they're underage, some of those things are going to be illegal and sometimes immoral. But also, they're trying to solve a crime. They're trying to find out what happened to someone. So when I'm writing books, I always tell people I don't know how to write a book, because when I wrote Girl in Pieces, I didn't know how to write a novel because I was a poet, but I set myself a task to figure out how to write that particular book, which I thought that subject matter was too big for just a poem. And I've learned now, like 5 books in, that I don't know how to write each book I'm about to write, because the book has to tell me how to write it sometimes as I'm writing it. And then I figure it out and I'm like, oh, this is how the voice is supposed to be, or this is how the book has to be structured. And now that you're 4 books in, is that the same for you? How do you feel now that you're 4 books in about your writing process?
I'm beginning to feel a little bit more confident, but I know that feeling that you're talking about of having to figure out how to write something, the book telling you how to write it. I do have that problem every time to an extent, because I think I'm always doing different things. I'm always kind of challenging myself. Learning thriller structure was something that I had to do. I had to learn screenplay structure, and I actually had an editor who kind of sat me down and said, you have to do 3-act structure, which I had not even heard of at that point, because I wrote my first book without knowing about that. It just kind of naturally fell into 3-act structure. I don't know why.
Was that the editor for Only She Came Back who told you that?
No. I've been through a bunch of editors. So
Okay.
that was my first editor.
And you went to learning about screenplay writing?
Yes, I just looked it up online and found tons of resources. I found out how to plot a novel on index cards, which I used for We Made It All Up, my 3rd book, and that was actually really helpful because it had dual timelines. I needed that.
So would you consider yourself very much a plotter now and not a pantser?
I would say so, but when I start a book, I kind of have to write the first 20 pages or so, just like pantsing, just no plan in mind. What about you? Do you have plot at this point? I mean, with mysteries, it must be hard not to.
Well, with Liz, because I think that for different books you have to adhere to different styles of writing them, and I think that it is, as Liz said, like it's necessary to plot out a mystery or a thriller, because you have to know where you are and what's going on and what to follow and what to write next, and where things have to happen, like the red herrings or the true clues and the twists. And so we had a spreadsheet before we started writing. We worked on the plot first and we had a spreadsheet. And because it's dual POV, that was the best way for us to write, because then she would write the Alice chapter and then I would know what to write for like Iris's corresponding chapter. And we also wrote it like very quickly, and we agreed to keep the chapters short, 10 pages or less, and then intersperse like text messages and police transcripts to give the reader a break, but also to keep it pretty fast paced. And I like the way that you incorporate different types of media in Only She Came Back as well. Do you want to talk about that a little bit? Like what choice, like why you made that choice?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I love found footage movies, so I always kind of wanted to write something that was the equivalent. And this is not really found footage. I mean, it's not entirely found material. There's a narrative, same as with the Agatha's books, but there are interspersed things. Like the very first section is a transcript of a video that was viewed online, and then there are other videos that Curie made out in the desert. That are kind of interspersed throughout the book. And there's a newspaper article. There are Curie's diary entries. Mm-hmm. And what I love is that the book designer actually made everything look different. She even used a handwriting font for the diary entries. So it really has a different feel, which I love.
Well, one thing when we were doing the Agathas as well, we wanted to, for those books. Liz and I primarily write contemporary realistic fiction, which I think is a whole other animal in a way. And I'm very much a pantser when I do those. I have an idea and I think about it for a long time, and then a character appears to me that could be the embodiment of that idea. And then when I write, I just write to 300 pages, which is kind of like my poetry background. Just spill it all out on the page. And then I have a draft, and then I go back and I can see, oh, this is really what I'm supposed to be writing about. And then maybe around the third or fourth draft, I'll hit the structure of the book, like how it wants to be actually written and the voice of the book. Did Sam's voice come to you like very early on, or was it something that you had to wait to hear?
It came to me right away, I think. Yeah, that came to me right away. I had to work harder on Curie's voice because really it's kind of the two voices alternating. And yeah, a lot of my books have sort of shy, retiring, introverted heroines like me, basically. So I think, so I channeled this voice that was not like me, who was really more sort of bold and in your face. And that was just kind of interesting. It was liberating in a way.
Was it a release for you to write a character like that?
Yeah, I think so. Although she does also have some characteristics in common with me, like being fascinated by true crime.
People, I totally understand that, because people always ask me like, oh, like what was your favorite character to write? And it's never, for me, it's never the main character. It's always the side characters, because I feel like I have more freedom with them, and it's kind of like a breath of fresh air where I think, oh, I can make this person like totally rebellious and in your face and things like that. And they're always my favorite characters to write. Whereas I'm just so like emotionally invested in the main character that sometimes they're not a pleasure to write, sadly. Although I enjoy writing them. Yeah.
Yeah. I need to point out that I love Ricky Randall, the lawyer in the Agatha's books. She is hilarious.
We had a lot of fun dreaming up the side characters, and Ricky Randall was one of our favorite ones to think about. Like, well, what if you just had this babysitter, your former babysitter, and she became a lawyer, and she's, we had to put in tropes. And what if she has a drinking problem? And what if she's very encouraging to them? Like, well, all right, girls, let's see how much you can lie. Maybe you can try this. And so, no one knew that we were writing those books either. We did it in secret. And so like our editors and our agents didn't know. And I think that allowed us, it allowed us, like, we had a lot of fun. And I think that one thing people don't talk about is like after your first book is out in the world, and then you get another contract for another book, the whole businessy side of it kind of comes in, and there's constraint then, because then you're on social media and you're trying to market your books and you're hearing things about other people's books. And I think that for me, it was really hard to write my second book with all that noise around me, whereas I had this really nice bubble when I was writing Girl in Pieces, because nobody knew that I was writing that either. And it was nice for Liz and I to kind of have that protective bubble where we felt like we can do whatever we want in this book. Like, absolutely.
That must have been so incredibly fun. I mean, did you have that on a sequel too, or was it a whole different process? Because at that point, the first book was closed.
It was a little bit of a different process, because we had to write the sequel. We didn't know that we were going to get a sequel, and then they were like, why don't you write a sequel? And we had to write that one really quickly, and it was a little bit, we left enough breadcrumbs in the first one that we had places to go in the second book, which is called The Night in Question. But I do wish more writers talked about how to keep yourself kind of cloistered when you're writing book after book after book, so that your true creativity can come out, and you don't have all these different voices from the world in your head telling you, well, you shouldn't do that, or that character is not likable, or this book isn't going to sell if you put that in there. And I wish more writers talked about that, like, a little bit. Are you good at blocking things out when you're writing?
Sometimes, yes. And yeah, I definitely know that feeling of writing an entire book, and it's total, you feel totally free because you haven't tried to sell it yet.
Mm-hmm.
But I have done 2 books on proposal. Only She Came Back was one of them. And that is, I find, because you do, you think, well, it sold because of these things, and I need to put more of these things in it as I continue to write the rest of the book.
Can you tell people who might not know, like, what that means to write a book on proposal?
It's when you write a certain amount of a book, like say 30 pages, and you submit it to an editor, and they buy it based on that. Usually about 3 chapters and a synopsis. So it's great because then you get the money, but you have to finish the book, and they have to like the book. I mean, it's not guaranteed that they will like the way the book turns out, and you might have to rewrite that book a few more times. Ask me how I know. Not with this book, but a different one.
I think too that's another thing that people might not know is that you sell a book and you're like, woohoo, this editor loves my book and we're going to work together, and then you get this thing called an edit letter. And sometimes it's like super long and single spaced, and you're like, oh my God. And sometimes they're like, yeah, this is really great. And it starts out well. This edit letter, you're like, oh, it's going to be great. And then they're like, also, you have to cut like 100 pages, or this isn't working and you have to rewrite this whole thing. The writing of the book isn't done when you sell it. In fact, really, that hardcore writing is just beginning.
Yes. It really is. I mean, it's a difficult process, but I love it.
So you are also a film critic.
Yes.
And what I love particularly about Only She Came Back is the cinematic quality to your prose and the unfolding of the story. And do you think that those two things are linked for you, your love of film, and that's linked to how you write your books? Like, do you picture it in your head as it's happening, almost as a movie playing before you?
I definitely do. I mean, that meme that was going around, like, do you see, when you think of an apple, do you see an apple? Do you see a photorealistic apple? Do you just see like the word apple? I definitely see the whole apple. I visualize everything, and setting is really important to me in my books. Seasons are really important, and sort of the color and the mood. So when I started that book, I did have this image in my head of this girl coming into a gas station in the desert with the bloody sweatshirt around her waist. And I knew, like, I'd been to that gas station. Mm-hmm. I knew what the light would be like. So it was very vivid for me.
So do you want to talk about the setting of Only She Came Back? Because I found that you did the setting really brilliantly. And one thing that I love in particular in the book is that the setting is almost a character in your book.
Yeah, well, I set the book in a town that I know well, Burlington, Vermont, but in a specific part of the town that is kind of like the commercial strip on the edge of it, not the trendy downtown that most people would know. And in particular, I set a lot of it in a movie theater where I have spent a lot of time as a movie critic. I love this theater because it was always empty. So you could always see a movie alone if you wanted to. And sadly, that right around when my book came out, that theater closed for good. That the Palace 9 is no more, which I called the Grand 9 in my book, and Sam works there. There's just something about movie theaters. I love the atmosphere of them because you always feel like you're so close to some kind of drama happening. Like you hear explosions in the background. It's sort of like the gateway to all these different stories. So I loved that as a setting for a lot of the scenes.
So the places in the book are actual real places and you rename them?
Yes, they are, including the sleazy motel. I think, yeah, most of the places are real places. And I was just talking with my coworkers today because they all recognized Sam's apartment building, and they said, oh yeah, it's that apartment building.
So you have a very popular TikTok account where you talk about, well, your parents, one, we can get to that, and your upbringing. And two, you talk about vintage YA. But I'm thinking now that you should make a video where you're walking around Burlington, and I think you should lead people on a tour of the real places in there that appear in Only She Came Back, because I think that people would get a real kick out of that.
I should do that. I have done a couple. I did one with that movie theater, the Palace 9, which I can never visit again, sadly. And another one with the park where Sam and Curie first meet on a cliff. I have my dad on that cliff because he was visiting me. So that was fun. But yeah, I should do some more tour videos. I'm not going to break into that motel though.
Are you sure? That might be a good video.
It probably would get a lot of views. Yeah.
So in your videos, what I love about your videos as well is you talk about your upbringing, and you will also appear as your dad and your mom in these videos. Do you want to talk about that a little bit? Because I find them actually very funny and also really touching.
Oh, thank you. That was just like a random thing that I started. I had this idea. Why don't I be me and my mom? Because my parents are pretty eccentric people. I mean, I was raised by professional musicians. They were very arty. They were just not like other people's parents.
Mm-hmm.
They were very permissive. They would let me read anything I wanted to read. So I have all these anecdotes from my childhood, and I just kind of like acted one of them out. And for some reason, that one went viral. Like it's the only really viral video I've ever had. It was TikTok is a strange and random place, but it really made me happy that people responded and kind of related to it.
Well, remember, I love that video that you made with your dad talking to the cat.
Oh, right, yeah. My dad was being like Martin Scorsese in that video, and oh my God, my dad can just talk and talk and talk. It's amazing.
I find those I find them very endearing that you're willing to open up like your childhood and actually bring your dad in and everything to help you on TikTok. And then
he's so willing. It was nice to do it. He was game.
And so did your parents support your writing? Like from a young age, were they like, of course you can write?
Yeah, I wouldn't say that they were the most positive people because they were artists themselves. So they always said, well, it's really hard to be in an artistic profession. You should not expect to be a writer as a career. You should have a different job. But they didn't discourage me from doing it. They just said, don't expect to make any money off it.
And when you were younger, who were your writing heroes?
Oh, geez. I had so many because like Madeleine L'Engle, Ursula Le Guin were huge for me. I loved fantasy. I had so many YA and kids authors I just totally idolized. That was the old days. So we couldn't email our favorite authors. We couldn't communicate with them on social media. They were just sort of these abstract entities who were out there.
I know you actually you just had to keep going back to the bookstore or the library and hope that a new book would be there.
Exactly. Yeah. Oh, Diana Wynne Jones. She was another big one. Did you ever read her?
No, I didn't.
Like Howl's Moving Castle. Yeah. So, right. So, and often you didn't even know that the books existed if they weren't in your library.
No, you just had to find a book. You had to go to the bookstore or go to the library and just start like pulling books off the shelf and looking at it and reading like the jacket flap and see if you'd be interested. Or, I read a lot of books that my mother left around the house. So I read a lot of adult books when I was very young. I learned a lot from them. Oh yeah. Yeah.
Yes, me too.
Yeah. My mother was like your parent. She said, "Oh, you can read whatever you want. I love that you read whatever you want." So, and so I did. And I'm a firm believer that kids are very good at self-censoring. If they're not interested or they don't like it, they will not continue to read it. They will pick up something else. And you should let them experiment and see what they like, because you never know what book they're going to find that really opens the world up to them.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. And I'm sure you've gotten a lot of great responses from kids about the Agatha's books because they're just such fun mysteries. I'm curious, have you been to a setting like Castle Cove? I mean, I know that's you don't live there in California, but
no. So when we were thinking about where we would set it, we were thinking about mystery tropes, like as Liz pointed out, oh, what about like a seaside town in California? And I had just read and then watched Big Little Lies. And I was like, that seems pretty good. And Liz lived in California for a long time, and she was very familiar with Big Sur. And so she based a lot of what we did in Castle Cove on Big Sur, like seaside cliffs in this town of like kind of haves and have-nots. And we really did want to talk about class in that book, and that's one of the reasons we made Alice very wealthy and Iris not so wealthy. And we had fun devising the town and thinking about, okay, here's where Alice and her wealthy friends would go. They would have parties at Levy Castle and big bonfires and things like that. And Iris and her friends who don't have a lot of money would go to the kind of shabby roller rink. That's where they would go for fun. That's what they could do. And we had a lot of fun thinking about setting in that book and making it like, how creepy could we make this seaside town, and how many secrets could we really embed in this town? Yeah.
Every town should have a roller rink. That's my principle.
Right.
And a castle. I mean, I love how Levy Castle kind of reminds me of like Hearst Castle or something like that.
That's what we were thinking about. Liz was like, well, let's base it on Hearst Castle. And so we did actually make a road trip, but we couldn't go in Hearst Castle because it was closed for renovation. So we had to do a lot of online research and also look at old news reports about William Hearst, because we sort of based Brooke Donovan's grandfather on William Hearst. And so we were reading a lot of like old newspaper articles and watching YouTube videos about William Randolph Hearst and Marion Davies to build out this relationship, and also the character of Mona Moody, the actress who fell to her death. So
I love how you have that old Hollywood stuff in there, interacting with the Agatha Christie and quotes from both.
Yeah, Liz she's a huge Agatha Christie fan, and we thought that that would be very cool if she had like a little quote from Agatha Christie at the top of every one of Alice's chapters, since Alice is a big Agatha Christie fan, and that would be their starting off point for, well, we'll use some tips and tricks from Agatha Christie books as a way for them to sort of start figuring out how to solve a mystery. But you don't have to have read Agatha Christie to read the Agathas. And one thing I want to ask you is, so the Agathas was the first book where I had a title and the editor kept it. I don't know that a lot of people realize that you can have a title when you're like working on your book, and then the book sells, and then your editor is like, actually, we're going to change that title. Have all your titles stayed the same, or did they change?
Let's see. One of them changed. So I have a pretty good track record.
Okay.
Actually, I have a book that isn't announced yet, and the title on that did change. So out of 5, 2 of them were changed, but this one, Only She Came Back, they did use my title. So I was very proud of that.
Can you tell us a little bit about the book that hasn't been announced yet? And congratulations on that.
Thank you. It is an adult book, and it's not really a thriller. It's kind of dark academia. It has middle-aged people in it, people my own age. But it also involves memories of their time in college. So you've got the flashbacks to being younger too. And it's something that I have actually been working on in different forms since I was in college. So more than 30 years. I can't believe that I finally got it in a form where I could sell it to a publisher. I'm just so happy about that.
That is amazing. And congrats again. And I can't wait to read it. Did you find, like, if you're writing for a YA audience and then you make the leap to adult, were there changes that you had to make in your style, or what you thought that you could put in the book?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of make these little decisions all the time, but I think it allowed me to do even more of what I love to do, which is describe things. And I actually use third person in this book, and all my YA books are first person. So that was very different, but fun. I like writing in different modes. And I want to hear a little, do you have a book that is announced at this point? I mean, I know I've seen a little bit about it online.
Oh, I have a solo book coming out in the fall called The Glass Girl, which is about a 15-year-old girl who is drowning under the weight of a lot of things, like her parents' nasty divorce, her beloved grandmother's death, a bad breakup with her boyfriend, and she's self-medicating with alcohol. And after one particularly bad night, she ends up in the hospital, and then she ends up in a rehab center in the outskirts of Tucson, and she has to figure out exactly how to confront what's going on inside her.
Wow, that sounds amazing. I know it'll make me cry.
Probably.
Which is a good thing.
Hello.
Hi.
This has been so fun to listen to you talk. There's lots of exciting questions, so we'll dig into them here in just a second. But I'd love to go back to follow up a little bit on Kathleen. You asked Margot about this, and I'd love to hear both of you speak to this a little bit more. A question that we get asked a lot as booksellers, or that we see get asked of other authors, is like sometimes there's actually a friend of mine who asked this question once where they were just like, oh, can you just like take your adult book and make it a YA version? And I think that there's times where a lot of people don't realize all of the differences between genre, and especially between like writing. Oh, and we have a dog.
Hi. Aww.
That's CJ. She wanted to know what's going on. Sorry about that. So I was wondering if you, especially Margot, since you have recently done this, but really would want your thoughts too, Kathleen, of somebody who has been writing in the YA space for so long and as well as you do, of like speaking to why it's not so simple for authors to just flip that switch and to just do that. Or if it was simple for you, Margot, that's amazing. But what were like the differences for you, which you started to go into a little bit of, like you got to add more detail. But I think that's something that people, us as readers, we don't always realize what you all go through in terms of figuring out like what genre you're going to write in, and how that can make an impact on like how you approach the writing process and what goes into that book.
I actually started out trying to write adult, although I didn't get any of those things published. So it was writing YA that was hard for me, that I had to kind of figure out. I had to read a lot of YA. And I think with the first YA novel I tried to sell, editors were saying it doesn't have enough immediacy. So I had to learn how to get that immediacy. And I think like the multimedia aspect of my book that's one way you can get immediacy. Short chapters, fast pacing, getting really close to the character.
I think that for me, when I was writing my Girl in Pieces, my first book, I didn't really even think about what it was, because I was mostly writing about this thing that had happened to me, but through the lens of the character Charlie Davis. And because I was like, well, I don't know how to write a novel. I'm not a novelist. I'm a poet. And no one cares about poets. So I said what I had to say, and I said it, how I wanted to say it. And I didn't know that some people would say you shouldn't write about self-harm or you shouldn't write about depression. But I had grown up reading books with very tough topics, like Margot and I were talking about as a teen. That was teen fiction. They talked about divorce. They talked about drugs. They talked about bad relationships, like all sorts of things. So that it was natural to me that I would write a book that had all those things in it. And two of the first books that I really loved as a teen was The Bell Jar and The Catcher in the Rye. And those were things that really spoke to me, those narrative voices. And also I was like, oh, wait, these are two really messed up teenagers, and I feel this way. And so it felt really natural for me to sort of write that way and in that style and subject matter. I don't know that I could write an adult book like per se. I think that would be it would be difficult because when you're writing for YA, you're writing about teens and the world is like open and raw for them and everything is brand new, and you have to remember that. Like you have to link back to that part of yourself that was that age. And if you have adults in a book, they have some tools to manage whatever is going on with the fictional setting around them, but they're also looking back on things. And so their perspective is much different. And I really, as Margot said, I like the immediacy of YA. I like the immediacy of that voice and that experience.
Thank you both. That's really interesting to hear you both talk about, because it's something that comes up a lot in our YA for Adults book club, of like reading through the lens of an adult versus a teen, and the ways in which that can also impact like your experience as a reader and like what you have to keep in mind, especially if you have like a 15-year-old where the world is fresh and new through their eyes, and so you're like, of course they would make that terrible choice, and also adults make terrible choices all the time. We just sometimes have a little bit more information that
Yeah.
should be helping us make a better choice than what we are.
Right.
But it's amazing to me when adults will read YA and they'll be like, oh, well, they shouldn't have done that. It's like, do you not remember what it was like to be 15 or 16 or how you felt? And I think if you are writing YA, you always have to keep that in mind, is that your characters don't have that perspective yet, because every minute is like a brand new thing.
Yeah.
Right. That's also what makes it so exciting and so fun to write and to read.
Yes. Especially when they're trying to solve a mystery.
Yes.
Yeah. Exactly. That actually perfectly segues into the next question, which is someone in the chat is wondering if you could speak a little bit to in particular how you do research for your books, and perhaps maybe what's the most like wildest Googleable thing that you've ever most wild thing that you've ever Googled, that you went down a rabbit hole where you're like, oh, if somebody saw this, they would know that I either am doing something terrible or that I write mystery, thriller, horror books.
Margot?
Oh, I didn't Google anything really good for this book, but I think I wanted someone to read a newspaper in French that was talking about a body being found. So I did a lot of Googling to figure out how a French newspaper would actually say that. So that was maybe a little suspect. I had another manuscript where I was Googling like how to make explosives and stuff like that. That was I'm probably on a few watch lists for that.
I think that for Liz and I, when we were doing the Agathas, like I was the problem, because part of what happens to Brooke in the Agathas, like how she goes off that cliff, was taken from an actual episode of Forensic Files, where these people pushed this young woman off a cliff, and she had shoe prints on the backs of her hands, so you know that they kicked her off, and that's how they found the people, was they matched the shoes to the shoe, the marks in her hand. And so I used a lot of real things that I had either watched or heard about or read. And there was an instance where we were trying to figure out a plot point in the book, and I was listening to a podcast about a grandmother who paid her least favorite grandson to take the fall for a murder that her favorite grandson had committed. And she said, you won't get that much time, and then when you get out, I'll give you like a couple $1 million. And he was like, okay. But then when he found out he was actually going to get a lot more time, he was like, oh no, you're all going down. And he like spilled the beans, and they all ended up in jail. And that ended up being like part of a plot point in the Agathas. And so I would call Liz and be like, I was listening to this podcast, we could do this. And she would say, oh my God, this draft is due in 3 days. Okay. And then we would like incorporate that. So I used a lot of real things that I read about or saw or heard. And I had a friend who's passed on now who was a neurosurgeon. And so I would ask him things about wounds, or like what bodies look like when they've been in salt water for 3 days or more. And he would always answer. And he was very excited to help out with that sort of research. So if you have friends in like the medical profession or the law profession, take advantage of them and thank them in the acknowledgments and send them like a present when the book comes out.
That's pretty wild. We know medical experts are really smart, but I love that like your friend had that information, he or she had that information just like readily available of like, yeah, this is what would happen to a body 3 days in salt water. Like,
yeah, he was also very helpful, because at one point when I was like, so what would happen if you hit someone in the head with a fire poker? Like, what would the wound look like? Like, what would happen to their brain? He's like, you know what? A fire poker is not really interesting. What about like a really heavy old-fashioned vintage candlestick? And I was like, oh, yeah. Uh-huh. And so you never know what really good information the people you know have.
Yeah. Do you know what made that more like interesting? Like, what is it? Just like it's worse on the head? Is that like it made the wound?
Because they were super, super heavy, and we were talking about a candlestick in like the 30s, and so they're really tall, and the base is very heavy because they can't be knocked over. And so if you hit someone in the head with it, it's going to make a little crater, and it's going to give them like a brain bleed and like a concussion, and it's going to crack their skull. And so then we're like, okay, now she's going to be in a coma for like 3 days and all this other stuff. And he was very helpful about that.
Listen, that makes the candlestick and clue make more sense too, as a more appropriate murder weapon. So
See?
this is really, it's all coming together.
Yeah.
Margot, your new challenge is to figure out what's the worst thing that you can put in this next book that you can Google, and you can come back to us with a report out.
Yeah, exactly.
Because it is that time of year, I think this is a great question coming from a listener. What either if you're not on Spotify, there's a follow-up, but I'm sure you've seen that this is the time of year that we get the Spotify Wrapped playlist. So they're wondering what your top artist and song were, or if you don't use Spotify, what you think would be probably your number one artist and song that you played this year.
I am so bad because I don't use Spotify, and I don't really listen to music that much. I mean, I like music, but most of what I hear these days is like on TikTok. So, but Burlington, Vermont was a very popular song on people's Wrapped, from what I understand. So yeah. So I've got that atmosphere down with my book.
So I'm a really strange writer in that I'll think about like what I'm going to write for a long time, but I don't actually start the drafting process until I hear organically a song that seems to embody like the emotional tenor of the book, and then I listen to that song over and over. And then I have other songs that appear to me and they become like a writing playlist for me. So my Spotify Wrapped, when I was finishing the draft of The Glass Girl in June, I was just listening to True Blue by Boy Genius over and over and over again on my headphones, like in the middle of the night while my kids were gone, trying to like bang out these like last pages. And so that ended up like Boy Genius ended up being like 6 of my songs on my Wrapped, and like True Blue was at the top. So that was the number one song for The Glass Girl. I'm kind of obsessive that way.
When you finish the book, can you ever listen to that song again, or is it like kind of like done, like once you're done with the draft or done?
Oh no, like it totally, it lives within me. And like when I started The Glass Girl, this song that was like the emotional core of it was a song called Boys Will Be Bugs by Cavetown. And they're very polar opposite songs, and it's really interesting to me that they both ended up like being responsible for the majority of writing this book.
I love that. Boy Genius is really on trend. What'd you say, Margot?
Do you put a playlist for the book on Spotify?
I don't have the one for The Glass Girl up, but there are ones up for my other books.
That's great.
Yeah. And what I really love about Spotify though is if you go on there and you look up like your book title, other people will have made playlists for your book, which I love because then I discover new music that I didn't know existed before, and I was like, that's really interesting.
That must be so cool.
You should look up your books and see if they're on there, and I bet you there's a couple playlists for them.
I don't know, but yeah.
I feel like it was like a fun way to get feedback from people on like what they think the vibes of your book are versus maybe what you listened to during it. So yeah, you should definitely look, Margot.
Yeah, that would be awesome.
It's definitely fun. Whenever we have like an author for a physical event, we always look up to see if either they made a playlist or if somebody like made a playlist that we agree with. And if not, we definitely make our own if we disagree with the Spotify playlist that's out there. Which can sometimes be like the Spotify playlist was correct, but it has too many explicit versions of songs that we kind of have to make our own from. Yeah. One last question before we get ready to end this live, and that is kind of returning to what we even started this conversation with a little bit too, of as people who write so many amazing books in the YA space, what is your hope for the future of the genre? And what are you excited about the genre, and what are you excited to see more of?
Oh, wow. I just hope that people continue to experiment in YA, and that we continue to have more diverse authors getting published, more non-white authors, LGBTQIA authors, just, showing the whole spectrum of experience. And I hope that this book banning trend is something that we can get past, because I think the majority of people are not in support of these book bans.
I agree with what Margot said. I hope that there's more diversity in the books being published and in the experiences being written about. I think that one thing about the book bans is that, they're applying to children because children have no power, and that's an easy thing for them. And when you're trying to deny someone's existence by a person's choice of reading, you're trying to erase their existence, because you find out things about the world or the way that you are or the way that you want to live someday through reading books. And that can be through any book. It's like realistic fiction, a thriller, a mystery, a fantasy novel. You find stuff that you latch onto that makes you feel better or feel hopeful. And so to try to deny that for children, I think, is really quite despicable. And everyone who's doing this should really just sit back for a little bit, because the teens now, they're getting ready to vote. And I was a teen, and you have a long memory as a teenager. I still hold grudges from adolescence, and they will vote. They will vote. So what you're actually creating here through trying to erase this experience of literature is kids who are going to vote you out of existence and your views out of existence. So you're actually giving them power when you think that you're taking it away, because they will remember.
I love everything about what you both just shared. And I don't know how much you know about Missouri politics, but that certainly really rings true for us. I know authors are exhausted by book banning and the toll that it's taking on them, and the concern that we have for kids. And it is also, we get to see upfront as booksellers how exhausting it is too for our educators, who are really working hard to make sure that kids see themselves in books, and that they have access to these books, and the ways in which that they're having to combat this on top of everything else that they have as an educator is also, it's bad for everybody all the way around. So I really hope
support your libraries and your teachers. Support your librarians and your teachers, because they're really doing the work to raise our kids, and this is what they do, and they love it, and you need to support them 100%.
That honestly is the perfect note to end on. I'm going to take away that you made me feel better, Kathleen, by saying kids are getting ready to vote. The teens are getting ready to vote. And so that feels like a
register to vote.
Exactly.
Register. Get ready. Run for the school board. You can run for the school board at 18. I don't know if a lot of kids know that. You can run for the school board at 18. Do it.
And actually, if you're in Missouri and if you're in St. Louis, we always have the supplies for you to register to vote at the bookstore, and information for you on how to get in contact with your legislators. So we're very happy to kind of continue that we don't have that for everybody, but if you call the store, we'll figure out what state that works for you. We have many people in our on staff who used to work for in politics and really know how to find that information for you. So we're happy to do that too. And a reminder for everybody that we talked about so many wonderful books on the live today. Both your backlist, yes, and your newer releases. Look at that, fans of each other. I love that you have those. We have those at the store, and we, if you're not local to St. Louis, don't worry. We do know how to use the mail, and we are happy to get these shipped out to you. So, Kathleen and Margot, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having us, Stephanie. Margot, thank you for chatting. I love chatting with you.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much, Stephanie, for hosting. This was really fun. I really enjoyed this.
Please say goodbye. Please say goodbye to your lovely dog for us.
CJ, yes. She has some things to say right now. So she's either saying goodbye to you or hello to somebody else. Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone watching.
Thank you. Thanks.
Bye.